Have you ever met a man who suddenly disappears? No explanation, no closure, just silence. One day he's present, the next he's gone, not just from one person, but from everyone. And the question that lingers is this: is he strong or is he running? Isolation as self-protection is one of the most misunderstood psychological behaviors in men. On the surface, it can appear cold, distant, even arrogant. A man who withdraws from others, who cuts off communication and builds walls around himself, is often judged as uncaring or emotionally unavailable. But beneath that exterior lies something far more complex, an internal system designed not to harm others, but to prevent further damage to himself. At its core, isolation is not about rejecting people, it is about managing emotional overwhelm. Some men experience feelings with an intensity they were never taught how to process. Instead of being guided through vulnerability, they learned early on that emotions are dangerous, that expressing pain invites judgment, or that opening up leads to betrayal. Over time, the mind adapts. It creates a simple but powerful rule: if connection brings pain, then distance must bring safety. This pattern often begins long before adulthood. A boy who grows up in an environment where his emotions are dismissed or punished learns to internalize everything. He stops expressing fear, sadness, or confusion, not because those feelings disappear, but because they are no longer safe to show. As he grows older, this internalization evolves into emotional self-containment. He becomes someone who handles everything alone, who trusts himself more than anyone else, and who sees reliance on others as a potential weakness. When relationships enter his life, they challenge this system. Closeness requires openness, and openness exposes what he has spent years trying to control. The deeper the connection, the greater the emotional risk. Small conflicts feel overwhelming. Misunderstandings feel like rejection. Vulnerability feels like standing unarmed in a battlefield. Instead of navigating these experiences, he reverts to the strategy that has always worked: he withdraws. Cutting people off, then, is not always a calculated act of cruelty. It is often an instinctive response to emotional threat. It allows him to regain a sense of control when everything inside feels unstable. By removing the source of discomfort, he temporarily silences the anxiety, the doubt, and the unresolved feelings that come with connection. In that moment, isolation feels like relief. There is also a strong element of self-preservation tied to identity. Many men build their sense of self around strength, independence, and control. Admitting emotional struggle can feel like a collapse of that identity. Isolation protects not just their feelings, but the image they hold of themselves. By staying distant, they maintain the illusion that they are unaffected, that they are in control, that they do not need anyone. However, this form of protection comes at a hidden cost. While isolation reduces immediate emotional discomfort, it prevents long-term emotional growth. The very experiences that could help him understand himself, conflict, intimacy, vulnerability, are the ones he avoids. As a result, the internal struggles remain unresolved, often intensifying over time. The mind becomes a closed loop, replaying the same fears and reinforcing the same defensive patterns. There is also a paradox within this behavior. The man who isolates himself often still desires connection. He may crave understanding, loyalty, and emotional safety just as deeply as anyone else. But because his past experiences have linked connection with pain, he finds himself trapped between two opposing forces: the need to be close and the need to protect himself. Isolation becomes the compromise, a way to avoid pain, even if it means sacrificing fulfillment. Over time, this protective mechanism can become automatic. It no longer requires a significant trigger. Even minor discomfort can activate the urge to withdraw. What once served as a defense against real harm becomes a habitual response to any form of emotional uncertainty. The walls grow higher, the distance becomes greater, and the idea of reconnecting feels increasingly difficult. Understanding isolation as self-protection shifts the perspective from judgment to awareness. It reveals that behind the silence is not always indifference, but often a history of unprocessed emotion, learned defense, and an ongoing attempt to maintain internal stability in the only way that feels familiar. The shadow within is the part of a man he refuses to see, acknowledge, or accept. It is not just made of darkness or negativity, but of everything he has been taught to suppress: his fears, insecurities, impulses, emotional wounds, and even certain desires that do not align with the identity he tries to maintain. When a man cuts everyone off, this hidden dimension of his psyche often plays a powerful and unseen role in shaping that behavior. From an early age, many men learn to divide themselves into what is acceptable and what is not. Strength is praised while vulnerability is discouraged. Confidence is rewarded while doubt is hidden. Over time, this creates a split within the personality. The traits that fit social expectations become the mask he presents to the world, while everything else is pushed into the background, forming the shadow. This shadow does not disappear. It remains active beneath the surface, influencing thoughts, emotions, and reactions in subtle but significant ways. When a man interacts with others, especially in close relationships, the shadow begins to reveal itself. Other people act as mirrors, reflecting aspects of him he may not consciously recognize. He may feel unexpectedly irritated by someone's behavior, deeply triggered by a comment, or uncomfortable in situations that seem harmless on the surface. These reactions are rarely just about the present moment. They are often tied to unresolved parts of himself that have been buried over time. Instead of recognizing these reactions as internal signals, he may project them outward. Projection is one of the most powerful ways the shadow operates. The qualities he cannot accept within himself are seen in others, often exaggerated or distorted. For example, a man who struggles with his own insecurity may perceive others as judgmental or critical. A man who suppresses his own emotional needs may view others as too demanding or dependent. In this way, the shadow shapes his perception of reality, making external relationships feel more threatening than they truly are. As these projections intensify, relationships become increasingly difficult to maintain. Every interaction carries the weight of unresolved inner conflict. Small disagreements feel personal. Emotional closeness feels invasive. Trust becomes fragile. The more he engages with others, the more his shadow is activated and the more uncomfortable he becomes. Cutting people off then becomes a way to escape not just the relationship, but the parts of himself that the relationship brings to the surface. There is also a strong element of control involved. The shadow represents what is unpredictable and uncontrollable within him. It challenges the image he tries to uphold and introduces uncertainty into his sense of self. By distancing himself from others, he reduces the chances of that shadow being exposed. Isolation allows him to maintain a more stable, controlled identity, free from the emotional disruptions that come with deep human connection. However, the shadow does not disappear in isolation. In fact, it often becomes more dominant. Without external interactions to reflect and challenge it, the shadow operates unchecked, influencing thoughts and behaviors from behind the scenes. The man may find himself becoming more rigid, more defensive, or more disconnected over time. What he avoids externally continues to grow internally. There is also a quiet tension that develops within. On one hand, he wants to see himself as composed, rational, and in control. On the other hand, the shadow continues to express itself through sudden emotional reactions, recurring patterns, and unexplained discomfort. This creates an internal contradiction that is difficult to resolve. Rather than confronting this contradiction, he may double down on avoidance, reinforcing the cycle of cutting people off whenever the shadow is triggered. But the presence of the shadow also explains why certain people affect him more than others. It is not always about compatibility or behavior. It is about resonance. Some individuals unconsciously touch deeper layers of his psyche, bringing hidden aspects of himself closer to the surface. These encounters can feel intense, confusing, or even threatening. Without awareness, the easiest response is to remove the source of that discomfort rather than explore what it reveals. Understanding the shadow within reveals that the act of cutting people off is often less about rejection and more about avoidance of self-confrontation. It shows that the real struggle is not with others, but with the parts of himself he has not yet integrated. The more he distances himself from people, the more he distances himself from the opportunity to understand and reconcile those hidden aspects. The fear of vulnerability is one of the most powerful forces shaping a man's decision to cut people off. It is not always loud or obvious. It often operates quietly beneath the surface, disguised as independence, control, or emotional detachment. What appears to others as strength is frequently a carefully constructed barrier designed to prevent exposure, because vulnerability to him does not feel like openness, it feels like risk. At the heart of this fear is the belief that being seen emotionally is dangerous. For many men, vulnerability is not associated with connection or healing, but with rejection, humiliation, or loss of control. This belief is rarely formed in a single moment. It is built over time through experiences where openness was met with dismissal, betrayal, or emotional pain. Each experience reinforces the idea that showing too much of oneself invites consequences that are difficult to recover from. As a result, he learns to manage how much of himself he reveals. He becomes selective, guarded, and increasingly private. Conversations remain on the surface. Emotions are filtered or suppressed. Even in close relationships, there is a part of him that remains hidden. This is not because he lacks depth, but because he fears what might happen if that depth is fully exposed. When vulnerability begins to emerge naturally, especially in moments of intimacy or emotional closeness, it can feel overwhelming. There is a sense of losing control, of stepping into uncertain territory where outcomes cannot be predicted. Trust becomes a calculated risk rather than a natural state. The more he feels himself opening up, the more intense the internal resistance becomes. This resistance is not always logical, but it is deeply ingrained. Cutting people off becomes a way to restore that sense of control. It is easier to end a connection than to navigate the discomfort of emotional exposure. By withdrawing, he avoids situations where he might be judged, misunderstood, or hurt. The act of leaving feels decisive and empowering, even if it is driven by fear rather than clarity. In that moment, distance provides immediate relief from the anxiety that vulnerability creates. There is also a strong connection between vulnerability and identity. Many men are conditioned to equate emotional openness with weakness. Strength, in their understanding, is about self-reliance, composure, and resilience without visible struggle. Admitting fear, insecurity, or emotional need can feel like a contradiction of that identity. It threatens the image they have built of themselves and the way they believe they must be perceived by others. Because of this, vulnerability is not just uncomfortable, it feels like a loss of status, both internally and externally. The fear is not only about being hurt, but about being seen as less capable, less stable, or less in control. This perception can be more difficult to tolerate than the pain of isolation itself, so he chooses distance, not because he prefers it, but because it allows him to preserve a version of himself that feels safer. At the same time, there is an internal conflict that often goes unnoticed. The desire for connection does not disappear simply because vulnerability is feared. He may still crave understanding, closeness, and emotional security. However, these desires are in constant tension with the fear of what it takes to achieve them. This creates a cycle where he moves toward connection, begins to open up, feels the discomfort of vulnerability, and then retreats before the connection can deepen. Over time, this pattern can become automatic. He may not consciously decide to cut people off. It becomes an instinctive response to emotional intensity. The moment a relationship begins to require more openness, more honesty, or more emotional presence, the fear is activated. Instead of addressing that fear, he removes himself from the situation entirely. This avoidance prevents him from developing the emotional skills needed to handle vulnerability in a healthy way. Without practice, vulnerability remains unfamiliar and threatening. The longer he avoids it, the stronger the fear becomes. What could have been a pathway to deeper connection turns into a boundary he refuses to cross. The fear of vulnerability also shapes how he interprets the actions of others. Genuine attempts at closeness may be seen as pressure. Emotional expressions from others may feel overwhelming or intrusive. Even trust can feel like a burden because it creates an expectation of reciprocity that he is not comfortable fulfilling. These perceptions reinforce his decision to withdraw, making it seem justified rather than defensive. In this way, cutting people off is not simply about ending relationships. It is about maintaining emotional distance as a form of self-protection. It allows him to avoid the uncertainty, exposure, and perceived risks that come with being fully seen by another person. Individuation and escapism may look similar on the surface, but they come from entirely different psychological intentions. Both can involve distance, solitude, and a step back from social life. Both can make a man appear withdrawn, independent, or disconnected, but one is a conscious journey towards self-understanding, while the other is an unconscious attempt to avoid inner conflict. When a man cuts everyone off, the difference between these two paths becomes crucial in understanding what is really happening beneath his behavior. Individuation is the process of becoming whole. It requires a man to turn inward, to examine his thoughts, emotions, patterns, and contradictions with honesty. It is not about rejecting the world, but about understanding his place within it. Solitude, in this context, is intentional. It is chosen not out of fear, but out of a desire to gain clarity. He steps back from noise and distraction so he can confront what exists within him without interference. This process is often uncomfortable. It forces him to face parts of himself he has ignored or suppressed. It requires responsibility, self-reflection, and the willingness to question his own beliefs and behaviors. Individuation is not a passive state, it is active inner work. Even in isolation, he remains engaged with his thoughts, his emotions, and his personal growth. There is movement, even if it is not visible from the outside. Escapism, on the other hand, may look similar but operates in the opposite direction. Instead of moving toward self-awareness, it moves away from it. The man who escapes also withdraws, but his intention is not to understand himself. It is to avoid discomfort, confusion, or emotional pain. The silence he creates is not used for reflection, but for distraction or suppression. He is not confronting his inner world, he is trying to silence it. In escapism, cutting people off becomes a way to remove triggers rather than address them. Relationships often bring challenges, misunderstandings, emotional demands, moments of vulnerability. These experiences can activate unresolved issues within him. Instead of working through those reactions, he eliminates the source. By distancing himself from others, he reduces the immediate discomfort, but the underlying issues remain unchanged. The key difference lies in awareness. A man on the path of individuation knows why he needs space. He can articulate it, even if only to himself. His withdrawal has direction and purpose. He understands that solitude is temporary and that eventually he must return to the world with a clearer sense of self. His relationships may pause, but they are not abandoned without thought. There is intention behind his distance. A man driven by escapism often lacks this clarity. His decisions feel reactive rather than deliberate. He may justify his behavior as self, focus, or independence, but internally there is confusion. He cannot fully explain why he feels the need to disconnect, only that being around others creates tension he does not want to deal with. The more he avoids, the less he understands himself, and the cycle continues. There is also a difference in emotional outcome. Individuation, though challenging, leads to a deeper sense of stability over time. As he integrates different aspects of himself, he becomes less reactive, more grounded, and more capable of handling complexity in relationships. His solitude strengthens his ability to connect because he no longer depends on others to define or regulate his inner state. Escapism produces the opposite effect. The more he withdraws to avoid discomfort, the less equipped he becomes to handle it in the future. His tolerance for emotional intensity decreases. Situations that require communication, patience, or vulnerability feel increasingly overwhelming. This reinforces his belief that distance is the only solution, even as it limits his capacity for meaningful connection. Another important distinction is how each path relates to responsibility. Individuation requires him to take ownership of his inner world. He recognizes that his reactions, triggers, and patterns are his to understand and manage. Escapism shifts that responsibility outward. It frames the problem as something external, other people, their behavior, or the demands of relationships, rather than something that originates within. Over time, these paths lead to very different identities. The man who pursues individuation becomes more integrated. He is aware of his strengths and his flaws, and he is less threatened by either. He can engage with others without losing himself because he has already faced the parts of himself that once caused instability. His solitude becomes a foundation for connection, not a substitute for it. The man who leans into escapism becomes more fragmented. The parts of himself he avoids remain unresolved, influencing his behavior in subtle ways. His identity becomes narrower, defined more by what he avoids than by what he understands. The distance he creates from others begins to mirror the distance he has from himself. The illusion of control is one of the most convincing psychological forces, but why some men cut everyone off. On the surface, it appears decisive, even admirable. A man who can walk away from people, who can detach without hesitation, seems to possess a rare kind of emotional strength. He looks like someone who is not dependent, not easily influenced, and fully in command of his life. But beneath that appearance lies a deeper reality where control is not truly gained, only simulated. At its core, control is about predictability. It is the desire to manage outcomes, reduce uncertainty, and avoid situations that feel unstable. Human relationships, however, are inherently unpredictable. They involve emotions, expectations, misunderstandings, and variables that cannot be fully managed. For a man who struggles with uncertainty, this unpredictability can feel threatening. It introduces elements he cannot fully control, and that lack of control creates internal tension. Cutting people off becomes a way to eliminate that tension. By removing relationships, he removes the unpredictability that comes with them. There are no more emotional surprises, no more conflicts to navigate, no more expectations to meet. In this controlled environment of isolation, everything feels simpler. He answers only to himself. He decides what to feel, when to engage, and how to respond. This creates a powerful sense of order, a structure where nothing external can disrupt his internal state. This is where the illusion begins. While he has reduced external complexity, he has not addressed the internal need for control itself. The underlying discomfort with uncertainty remains intact. It has simply been relocated. Instead of dealing with unpredictable people, he now manages his environment to avoid any form of unpredictability altogether. His world becomes smaller, more contained, and carefully regulated. What feels like control is actually restriction. There is also a psychological reinforcement that strengthens this behavior. Each time he cuts someone off and experiences temporary relief, his mind interprets it as a successful strategy. The absence of conflict feels like peace. The lack of emotional demand feels like stability. This reinforces the belief that distancing himself is the correct way to maintain control. Over time, this pattern becomes automatic. The moment a situation begins to feel uncertain or emotionally complex, the impulse to withdraw is triggered. However, this type of control is fragile. It depends entirely on avoidance. As long as he continues to remove anything that challenges him, the illusion can be maintained. But the moment he is faced with a situation he cannot escape, an unavoidable relationship, an internal emotional response, or a life circumstance beyond his control, the sense of stability begins to crack because he has not developed the ability to tolerate uncertainty. Even small disruptions can feel overwhelming. There is also a deeper contradiction within this behavior. While he believes he is in control, his actions are often driven by an unconscious need to avoid discomfort. In this sense, it is not he who is in control, but the fear of losing control that dictates his decisions. The choice to cut people off may feel intentional, but it is often a reaction to internal pressure rather than a deliberate, balanced decision. His behavior is guided more by what he is trying to escape than by what he is consciously choosing to build. This illusion also affects how he perceives independence. He may see himself as self-sufficient, someone who does not rely on others and therefore cannot be influenced or hurt by them. But true independence is not the absence of connection. It is the ability to engage in connection without losing stability. By avoiding relationships altogether, he is not proving his strength, but limiting the situations in which his strength can be tested and developed. Over time, the controlled environment he creates can begin to feel empty. Without external input, challenge, or emotional exchange, his experiences become repetitive. The absence of conflict may bring temporary calm, but it also removes opportunities for growth. Relationships, despite their unpredictability, offer reflection, feedback, and expansion. Without them, his sense of self can become static, defined by routine rather than evolution. There is also a subtle loss of adaptability. Control, when overused as a defense, reduces flexibility. He becomes accustomed to environments where he dictates the terms and less capable of functioning in situations that require compromise, patience, or emotional resilience. This further reinforces his reliance on isolation as it becomes the only space where he feels comfortable and in charge. The illusion of control is powerful because it feels real in the moment. It provides immediate relief and a sense of authority over one's environment. But it does not resolve the deeper issue, which is the inability to tolerate uncertainty and emotional complexity. What appears as control from the outside is often a carefully maintained distance from anything that might disrupt an internal sense of order.